Good morning, church. The book of Acts is called the book of Acts because it records the acts or the works of the apostles. That is, we see the acts of the remaining 12 disciples of Christ, and we see that of Paul. We rightfully admire the work that they did in the early church, and we can learn much from studying and trying to emulate them. However, the primary hero of Acts is not the apostles, nor is it the early church in general, but it is the Holy Spirit. Individual lives are changed by the work of the Holy Spirit, but we also see him at work in the church more broadly speaking. Let me give you a few ways in which the Holy Spirit works in the church, at least in the book of Acts, and I think that this carries into today as well. First, the Holy Spirit works in the growth of the church. That is, people are brought into the church because the Holy Spirit works in the lives of people. Second, the Holy Spirit works in the setting of the church apart from the world, that is, sanctifying the church. The Holy Spirit works in the hearts of Christians and in local congregations so that they learn that they are children of God, not children of the world. Third, the Holy Spirit works in the church's relation to governing authorities. That is, the Holy Spirit works in a way so that the church is able to function even though there are governing authorities that have been placed over us. And then fourth, the Holy Spirit works to allow the church to impact society in a positive way. Over the next few weeks, my plan is to cover the ways in which the Holy Spirit works in the church. Today, I want to focus on that first one, that is, the Holy Spirit works in the growth of the church. Before we look at that, let me read the words of Jesus in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, because I think it relates to this idea. But you will receive the power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and the ends of the earth. Jesus promises the disciples that the Holy Spirit will come and that they will be empowered to be his witnesses through the Holy Spirit. Now let's look at what God does in the book of Acts in relation to church growth. First, we see that the Holy Spirit increases the number of Christians. In fact, there are over 25 references in the book of Acts where we see that the church is growing in number. Let me read you a few. Chapter 2, verse 41 says 3,000 souls were added to them. Chapter 8, verse 12, it says both men and women were being baptized. Chapter 9, verse 31 says they multiplied. Chapter 11, verse 21, a great number believed and turned to the Lord. 14, verse 1, a great multitude of both the Jews and Greeks believed. Chapter 16, verse 5, it says that they increased in number daily. Chapter 17, verse 12 says that many of them believed. Chapter 17, verse 34, and some men joined him and began to believe. So we see that the Holy Spirit works in increasing numbers. We as Christians, we have a role to play. We are called to share the gospel, to bring the gospel to people next to us as well as on the other side of the world. But it is the Holy Spirit that accomplishes the act of bringing people to the full knowledge and faith of Jesus Christ. Second, we see that the Holy Spirit works in increasing the church's area of influence. Back to that verse in chapter 1, verse 8, it says that the Holy Spirit was going to make the disciples his witnesses in Jerusalem, Samaria, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. And in the book of Acts, we see that influence starting to happen. We see it in Jerusalem. In chapter 2, verse 4, we see that they are filled with the Holy Spirit. In chapter 2, verse 36 and 40, we see Peter preaching to the people. And then shortly after that, we see that the 3,000 were added to the church. We see then that Samaria begins to be included. Philip, a person that was filled with the Holy Spirit, he goes to Samaria and he shares the gospel. And what happens is that influence is spread to Samaria and Samaritans become Christians. Next is Judea. Philip is then directed to go to Judea, and he directly encounters an Ethiopian eunuch. This eunuch is baptized and becomes a Christian. Following the conversion of Paul, we see this verse in chapter 9, verse 31. The church then had peace throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria, and it became stronger as the believers lived in the fear of the Lord, and with the encouragement of the Holy Spirit, it grew in numbers. And then we see, as we go through the book of Acts, we see that the gospel is brought to Joppa, Antioch, Syria, Iconium, Derbe, Lystra, Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, Athens, Corinth, and Ephesus. We see that Peter, Paul, Barnabas, Silas, and many others, through the power of the Holy Spirit, began to bring the church to all of these different areas. Church programs, good preaching, good facilities, these are all good things. But none of those ultimately brings growth, at least not in the truest sense of growth of the church. It is through the power of the Holy Spirit that growth actually happens. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 6, because I want us to keep in mind that we don't sit back and just let the Holy Spirit do his thing, that the Lord has something for us to do. That is, we are to share the gospel. We are to live out the gospel. We see in this verse that Paul says this, I planted the seed, Apollos watered it. So we see these two men doing their part. But he says this, but God has been making it grow. I pray that we keep this in mind as we build, as we implement various programs, and we do whatever God has called us to do. We need to remember that we are to walk in the Spirit, and remember that through faithfulness, God will give the bounty, not our works bringing the bounty about. I'll be praying for you. Please pray for me, and Lord willing, I'll see you next week.